within the sort of like, I guess, the personal realm, right? Like, I mean, if we know that from a movement level, it is about organizing in largely through our labor in some instances to sort of like affect change and begin to sort of address these the vacuum of answers in, you know, whether they're material answers or sometimes, you know, sort of explanations, I think, which conspiracy and sort of an anti-authoritarianism that is unhinged and distinct from any type of ideological bearing, I guess. Like, what do we do on an individual level?
Well, it's interesting around the conspiracy, because one of the things I get into in the book is the way anti-Semitism has always been used to damage left-wing coalitions. And, you know, back to the first failed Russian Revolution in the early 1900s, before the successful one, there was an attempt to overthrow the Tsar, and the Jewish Labor Bund was absolutely central as part of this, which was, you know, a left-wing labor coalition of Jews that also had militias. And after that revolution failed, the Tsar's response was twofold: one, to offer some minor, like a weak parliamentary democracy, not real democracy, and the other was to unleash the hounds of anti-Semitism onto this coalition that had almost had a successful coalition, and to distribute the protocols of the Elders of Zion and to pit the Christian working class against the Jewish working class. And this led to some of the bloodiest pogroms in history. Now, I think what we're seeing, which is simply to say that conspiracy, like the idea that there is a group that are, you know, there's a room somewhere where the elders are plotting and are figuring it all out, has always been a political project. It is an elite protecting political project. It's not apolitical. It serves elite power very, very well because it distracts people and pits working classes against one another.
It's depoliticizing on some level because it becomes about mystification, right? I mean, if it's not a political structure that we're dealing with, if it's just a bunch of, like, you know, folks in a room who,
well, it protects the existing political structure,
right? Okay.
Right? And it gives you a target. It's the oldest story in the book. What is happening now is that anti-Semitism and the fight against anti-Semitism, and we must fight anti-Semitism, is also being used to break apart left political coalitions,
right?
And all kinds of inter-ethnic divisions are being sown. Bannon is really good at this. I mean, he calls what he's building now inclusive nationalism, because basically what he's doing is peeling away, in the same way that he peeled away some, you know, white working class guys who had voted Democrat and brought them over to Trump. Now he's trying to do it with Latino and Black men who are upset that they think their teachers are turning their kids trans. And he's like, come on over, we can work with this, right? But this is what they're doing. I mean, maybe we're disagreeing over terms. I do see it as a very political project, but what it is doing is steering away from a critique of structures, a socialist project that would seek to build different structures. So what do? We stick together. We work through it. We have zero tolerance for Islamophobia, racism, transphobia, anti-Semitism. I mean, this is why you know, I think it is very, very important that we have a moral left that stands strong against the targeting of civilians and for international law, regardless of the context. Because how are we supposed to say that Israel needs to abide by international law if we're saying that Hamas doesn't need to abide by international law? So, but we need to be guided by values. We need to be guided by morals. We need to have a absolutely firm line on anti-Semitism and not give into any of these, you know, temptations to, you know, believe that there's some room somewhere. And we need to build the alternative, which is that a left that is focused on real systems of power and proposing alternatives, which brings us back to why it was such horrifically bad timing that a political project that was bringing people out of their not just their individual identity groups, but also the sort of the individual self that is the promise of capitalism, right? Like, you're going to improve yourself, you're going to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Bernie's campaign, which brought people together, was not me, us, right? And it wasn't like, oh, that you don't matter, but that there is an us, that you don't need to confront these systems on your own, that you can be part of a movement that is taking on medical debt, that's depersonalizing it, that's taking on student debt, that's fighting for real systemic responses and solutions like universal public health care, and a $15 minimum wage. These are all examples of what we need to be doing. I think what we learned from the Bernie campaign is that a campaign is not a political campaign, an electoral campaign is not a sturdy enough structure to hold the left, right? And so when Bernie loses, and it wasn't fair, and there was the whole party ganged up on him, as was totally predictable. But when that happened, then we were just kind of dumped in a sea of me, like all of us who had been part of this not me, us. It was suddenly me, 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 me. And that's when you saw everybody turning on each other. And then, yes, it coincided with lockdown. And so we weren't able to gather.
It coincided with the most isolated you could probably be under any context, right? Like, everybody go home
let's not
and be
forget
with
Black Lives Matter and that spring,
right.
And the fact that people came into the streets despite the lockdowns, and acted with incredible solidarity and in multiracial coalition, Black led. That was a really, really important rupture, right? And I think that I think some of those coalitions fell apart in part because they were trying to kind of maintain themselves over Zoom and the sort of interstitial moments when people in movements are able to be together and maybe cut each other some slack weren't there. I mean, that's part of the story, but it's not the whole story by any means.
Maybe a path forward, I guess, just to bring it back to what you were saying about the hopefully the anti-war movement maintaining itself and being unceasing, is a solidarity movement that opposes nationalism in all of its forms, whether it's ethnic or religious nationalism, which I think dovetails nicely with the racial protest that for equality that you describe. Because we've said this on the show, when it comes to Zionism, it's not about the Jewish part of Jewish nationalism; it's the nationalism that's the problem. It's not the Christian part of Christian nationalism that's the problem. It's the nationalism part. And you can apply that to all of the other contexts that you describe of these resurgent kind of nationalist far-right movements internationally. Yeah. That could be, I think, maybe a big umbrella term to combat many of the things that we're talking about.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And I think that, this is why, when I eavesdrop on various conversations that are happening on the, more Zionist, in more Zionist parts of my family, and, what are the stories that are being told to rationalize these war crimes? It's fear. It's fear that if the boot is lifted off of Palestinians' necks, even for a moment, then they will do to Jews what Jews did to them in the Nakba and have just been doing to them, which is ethnic cleansing. And when you have Hamas leaders that go on, Lebanese television and say, yeah, that's the plan, it doesn't help, because those clips get played over and over and over again in Israel, but that, what you're speaking to, Emma, is the fact that there needs to be a principles-based, like a values-based, principled-based left that is standing up to nationalism in all of its forms. And so that means that it doesn't get to be Hamas's turn to ethnically cleanse the Jews. Like, that's not going to be the vision of justice. And we will stand up to that in the same way. And I think that people aren't hearing that enough. I don't think people are hearing that. I think Jews aren't hearing that enough. I think Israelis aren't hearing that enough from the left, of saying, that's not the vision of the future that we're going to allow to happen. And the fears are not without any basis. I think one of the lessons of, I was reading Vincent Bevan's book, Until We Burn, about he calls it the decade of the mass protests, and he's talking about the Arab Spring, and he's talking about all of these huge mass mobilizations that have come from the left, but have often failed. And often what has happened is that there's been a political vacuum that gets opened up through mass movement. And if you aren't ready with what your vision is to fill that, and if you don't have a political project, then somebody else is going to fill it for you, right? And what happened in Egypt was that you had like a big, largely secular youth movement in Tahrir Square that didn't have a political program, that wasn't ready to take power, and the Muslim Brotherhood entered into that vacuum, and then was violently overthrown. And now you have Sisi, who's worse than Mubarak. But the lesson of that tragedy, and it's ongoing because so many incredible activists remain behind bars in Egypt, is, when we resist, we can't just be saying no. We also have to have a plan for the yes, and we have to have these legible values and principles of what we stand for, because it isn't without basis to have a fear that Hamas wants to ethnically cleanse. Especially when you have leaders who go on television saying that that's what they want. That doesn't mean that that is what will happen, but it does mean that we have to be honest about the sort of landscapes that we're in.
Is that when you talk about creating uncomfortable coalitions in the book, what specifically are we talking about in that regard?
I mean, I think any good coalition is uncomfortable. If it's comfortable, it means it's probably not wide enough. I think partly what I'm talking about, Sam, is that, I think that there's some sort of very reactionary anti-identity politics discourse on the left, where it's like this idea of like, we all have to put our identities aside and come together in this universalist mush kind of, and I think honestly, that's partly why Bernie couldn't go all the way. I don't think Bernie could totally understood that there wasn't going to, that the us had to have a lot of different positionalities in it. And that we can come together, but we're not going to check our pasts at the door, our different ways in which we enter coalition. And that recognizing that we come with these pasts, traumas, intergenerational traumas. I think these anti-war coalitions that are coming together are uncomfortable, and really uncomfortable conversations are happening along the lines that we're talking about right now. Coming back to Israel-Palestine, what I mean about being clear about values and building on what you were saying, Emma, about being clear that it's the nationalism that is the problem. One of the things I do at the end of the book is look at the ways in which the Nazi project was a kind of doppelganger of colonialism, and Hitler was very clear about this. He talked, he was fascinated with the Western frontier in the U.S. and in Canada. And the German idea of Lebensraum, of elbow room, of needing more space, that was the Eastern frontier. And he would draw direct parallels between the Slavs as his Indians, right? And he's like, we're gonna get rid of them in the same way that the Americans did and the Canadians did. And do we ever think of them when we have bread? I think he said when we have bread with wheat from Canada, do we ever think of the Indians? He was very clear about what he was learning, also from U.S. Race law, from eugenics in the U.S. So it wasn't a doppelganger in the sense of like, obviously he did things that had never been done before. It was a Fordist genocide. Nobody had killed as quickly and on a scale like that before. But he learned a lot. He learned a lot and he talked about how the British came up with the idea of concentration camps and so on. And there was a lot of denial, certainly in the way I was taught the Holocaust in my Jewish education, in my Jewish day school. We never learned any of these connections, and there were a lot of anti-colonial scholars, Aimé Césaire, who talked about the Holocaust as colonialism turned inward, W.E.B. Du Bois saying, in the 1950s, there's nothing that Hitler did that had not been done to, the quote unquote darker nations around the world. But this is not what we learn in schools, right? We learn this very, very exceptional story. Why does that matter? It matters because we did not see the connections between race law in the U.S., the Indian reservation system, residential schools. Because we didn't look at these connections, then it somehow seemed plausible that as a form of twisted reparations for the Holocaust, Jews get to be colonizers in Palestine, get past the mantle of whiteness as literally reparations. Like when Germany gave reparations to the state of Israel, they were explicit that this was reparations for their sins. And they gave a huge amount of money in the form of infrastructure support for their early state. So this is it's only possible to imagine this as reparations if you are not seeing the connections and what Hitler learned from colonialism. And so, and this is why it's sort of extraordinary that we're not allowed to talk about Israel's settler colonialism, that this is somehow anti-Semitic. It's like a war on history. It's a war on memory. It's a war on understanding. We can't understand any of this, including the Holocaust, without understanding settler colonialism. Because this is one long chapter that's just been moving locations.